On the night of November 10, 1989, the world witnessed one of the most important events of the last century, the fall of the Berlin Wall. More than paving the way for the reunification of Germany after more than half a century of division, the fall of the wall is considered the starting point for the fall of all the communist regimes that existed in Eastern Europe. One by one, the communist governments of countries such as Hungary, Poland, and Romania fell until 1991, when the Soviet Union, the great communist giant, also fell. What remains of that era for many is only the legacy of the Soviet Union, which for some is a symbol of success and for others of absolute failure. The truth is that communism did not work in any of these countries, but there was one in particular that was in the same region and could be considered different from the others. Yugoslavia, despite being communist like almost all the countries around it, did not follow the Soviet Union's handbook and developed a model of communism that some still consider a success. But if that is true, why did the country disappear along with the others? What were the differences between the communism of the Soviet Union and that of Yugoslavia? If you want to know the answers, just watch this video, because today we're going to expand our global knowledge about Yugoslavia, starting with the curious way the country came to be. To understand in depth the formation of Yugoslavia, one would have to go back at least a few centuries to understand how the Slavic peoples occupied the region, and all the geopolitical changes that took place over time. But in a nutshell, we can define 1918 as the year the country was born, with the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The idea behind the creation of the new country was to unite the Slavic peoples of the southern region, who had similar languages and traditions. Apparently, the differences were greater than the similarities and, mainly due to internal political issues, several conflicts began between the ethnic groups. The biggest dispute of this period was between the Serbs, who were the de facto rulers of the country and wanted a centralized administration, and the Croats, who advocated the creation of a federation and more autonomy for each of the regions that made up the kingdom. In an attempt to truly unify the country and put an end to internal disputes, King Alexander III decided in 1929 to found the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which stands for the Kingdom of the South Slavs. Unification was only on paper, because in practice power remained concentrated in the hands of the Serbs and tensions only increased, to the point that the king was assassinated in 1934. If the situation was complicated at home, it was even more so on the international scene, as the advance of Nazi troops through Eastern Europe led to the invasion of the country in 1941 and the creation of a Nazi state in Croatia. After 23 years of existence, the dream of uniting the South Slavic peoples seemed destined to become history. But it was then that the most important name in the country's history and one of the most significant world leaders of the last century appeared on the scene. Josip Broz was born in the territory of present-day Croatia, when the country was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The son of a Croatian father and Slovenian mother, he fought in World War I defending the empire of his birth. During the war, he was wounded in combat, captured by the Russians, and taken prisoner. It was on Russian soil that he first came into contact with communist ideology and even participated in some of the events of the Russian Revolution of 1917. A few years later, he returned to his homeland, which was now the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and became an active member of the local Communist Party. As the party was considered illegal, its members went underground, and Josip Broz adopted the code name Tito, which would accompany him for the rest of his life. Tito's military knowledge and experience in underground fighting were essential for him to lead the resistance movement against the Nazi invasion. Under his command, the militias known as partisans, who fought against Nazis and fascists, managed not only to protect most of the territory, but also to regain the region of Croatia from German control. This was practically the only region in Eastern Europe that was not liberated from the Germans by the Red Army of the Soviet Union, a fact that, as we shall see, would be decisive for the future of the country. At the end of the war, Marshal Josip Broz Tito took control of the country and founded the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a federation grouping Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, as well as Kosovo and Vojvodina, two autonomous regions of Serbia. How did Tito manage to resolve the differences between these countries? It was clear to Marshal Tito that creating a single sentiment among the population of 6 different republics was not possible, and he also had the examples of previous failed attempts. So, in order to maintain unity within Yugoslavia, he used the same heavy hand that Alexander the Firnid used, but granted certain autonomies to the different regions. The government's motto was brotherhood and unity, which pointed to the existence of several different peoples within the country. But make no mistake, the country was a dictatorship, and any nationalist movement within any of the federations was violently repressed. Thousands of opponents were persecuted, many sent to concentration camps, and several lost their lives. The regime established in Yugoslavia after World War II was very similar to that of the Soviet Union, and even the constitution adopted was similar to the one Stalin had introduced in the socialist bloc in 1936. For geographical and ideological reasons, the two blocs became allies of the First Order. There was cooperation in several sectors, especially in the economic sector, since Yugoslavia had a weak economy and lacked natural resources. But the cooperation was short-lived. In just 3 years, the personalities of Tito and Stalin led the countries to break off relations. It is no secret that all communist governments around the Soviet Union were puppets of Moscow after the Red Army expelled Nazi troops from their territories. In the case of Yugoslavia, there was no such debt, and Tito did not feel obliged to follow Stalin's orders. The disagreements began because the Soviet dictator did not approve of the expansionist plans of Tito, who claimed control of the Italian city of Trieste and had plans to form the Balkan Federation, together with Albania and possibly Bulgaria. Stalin was also against Tito's support for the Greek Communist Party during the Greek Civil War. The disagreements led to Yugoslavia's expulsion from the Cominform, which was an association of communist parties founded by Stalin and controlled by the Soviet Union. Through this organization, Moscow controlled the communist parties in virtually all of Europe and maintained its influence in the countries they ruled. With its expulsion, Yugoslavia not only distanced itself from the Soviet Union, but also from the communist doctrines of the bloc. It was from 1948 onwards that a different approach, known as autonomous socialism, began to be applied in Yugoslavia. Unlike the Soviet Union, where everything was said to belong to the people, but in reality everything belonged to the party, and all decisions were made at the top of the pyramid, in Yugoslavia control of enterprises, factories and farms was actually handed over to the workers. In practice, it was the workers who made the business decisions. They were free to decide what to produce, how much to produce, from which suppliers to buy inputs, and, most importantly, how much to charge for the final product. It was virtually a free market, where decisions were made on the basis of supply and demand, whereas in the Soviet Union, all decisions were centralized, and enterprises were limited to producing and meeting the targets set by the government. The degree of autonomy of the workers was total, and they could define their own salaries and the destination of the profits, which could be reinvested or even distributed among the employees. The break with the Soviet Union also served to bring Yugoslavia closer to Western countries, and Tito was able to take advantage of the dispute between the United States and the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War. While NATO and the Warsaw Pact harbored US and Soviet allies respectively, Tito, along with the leaders of Egypt and India, Ghana and Indonesia, founded the Non-Aligned Movement in 1956. As its name suggests, the organization brought together countries that wanted to remain neutral in the conflict. This position of neutrality helped Yugoslavia receive billions of dollars in loans and military aid from the United States, even after relations with the Soviet Union were restored following Stalin's death. All this contributed to the growth of the Yugoslav economy and the improvement of the quality of life in the country. To get an idea of the evolution, in 1950, shortly after the break with the Soviet dictator, Yugoslavia's gross domestic product per capita was almost half that of Hungary and Poland. After the changes, the economy grew for almost 3 decades in a row, and by 1980, Yugoslavia's GDP per capita had increased almost 5-fold and had reached the same level as Hungary and surpassed Poland. Political decisions were also reflected in the daily lives of citizens. There were more freedoms for the inhabitants of Yugoslavia than for those of the other communist countries. Yugoslavs, for example, could travel freely to most countries in the world, while Soviets, Romanians, and East Germans, to name just 3, could only move within the countries that were part of the communist bloc. The opening of the borders also allowed thousands of citizens to leave to work in other countries, and the money they sent home also became an important source of funds. During this period, the government strongly encouraged the industrialization of the country to replace agriculture as the engine of the economy. Between 1950 and 1967, industry went from accounting for just over 20% to almost 40%, while agriculture declined from 28% to 23% of all output. This change was accompanied by investments in education, with an illiteracy level very close to zero, and universal healthcare. As can be imagined in a socialist state, both education and healthcare were provided by the government at no cost to the population. The model of self-managed socialism adopted meant that, on average, the country's citizens had a standard of living close to that of Western European countries at the time, with the right to better cars and even vacation homes, something unthinkable in communist countries. But if the country was so good, and the system worked so well, why did Yugoslavia disintegrate? For more than 3.5 decades, the country was ruled with an iron fist by Tito, the country's president for life. In all this time, he managed to balance domestic politics, with some regional autonomies, and foreign policy, negotiating with both sides to maximum advantage. Proof of his global reach was the attendance of 129 heads of state at his funeral in 1980. The figure was a record for the time, and not even leaders like Nelson Mandela and Pope John Paul II managed to attend his funerals. With Tito's death and no successor ready, the situation began to get complicated. During the 1970s, the country had been affected by several world crises, such as the 1973 oil crisis. The dictator's good international relations helped the country to get loans to cope with the turbulence, but on the other hand, increased the foreign debt from $2.3 billion at the beginning of the decade to more than $20 billion in 1981. The situation continued to worsen, and by 1985 the country's debt was equivalent to half of its GDP. The system of autonomous socialism also had its flaws, which showed that regional characteristics had not been taken into account in its formulation. During the 1980s, enterprises in the north, especially those in Croatia and Slovenia, proved to be more efficient and competitive than those in Macedonia in the south. Regional disputes that had lain dormant under the Tito dictatorship returned with greater force in the second half of the decade, especially in Serbia, where local politicians saw an opportunity to regain the control they once had over the other countries. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia, after holding a plebiscite, decided to leave the bloc and become independent. Serbia's reaction was to start a war. In the case of Slovenia, the war lasted only 10 days, but Croatia faced a war of more than 5 years and thousands of deaths before becoming independent. After the end of the Soviet Union that same year, part of the former bloc's military arsenal was illegally sold to various groups fighting in Yugoslavia, fueling a period of wars and massacres in the region. The wars that took place on the territory of the country were at the time the largest conflict on European territory since World War II, precisely the conflicts that allowed the emergence of modern Yugoslavia. Officially, the country existed until 2003, when it changed its name to Serbia and Montenegro, but it was no longer a shadow of its former self. Although it took a different path in ideological and foreign affairs, Yugoslavia ended up in the same way as the Soviet Union, and, like all communist countries in Eastern Europe, communism has become a thing of the past. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to receive more amazing content. Thanks to all of you who have joined us, and until next time.